She walked in smiling but walked out mid-show, leaving the audience stunned and Stephen Colbert speechless. What started as a normal interview turned into one of the most explosive moments in late-night TV history. The camera caught it all. The tension, the meltdown, the walk-off, and what happened next sent shock waves across America. This wasn't just TV drama. This was a political earthquake. You won't believe how it all unfolded. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had always been a space where comedy met current events, where laughter softened the harsh edges of reality. The studio lights glowed warmly. The applause signaled comfort, and the stage felt familiar to millions of Americans who watched each night to escape, to chuckle, and to think. On this particular night, the energy was no different. At least at first. Stephen entered with his usual charisma. The audience responded with cheer and the rhythm of the show began like any other. But what no one realized was that tonight's episode wouldn't follow the usual pattern. Tonight would be remembered for reasons no one saw coming. Karoline Leavitt walked onto the stage with poise. A composed figure carrying the weight of her position as White House press secretary. Dressed in a smart outfit, she wore a confident smile, the kind that suggested she had been in far more difficult situations and had come out on top. The crowd greeted her with a mix of curiosity and cautious applause. Some respected her, others didn't, but all were intrigued. She took her seat across from Stephen with ease, and for a few moments, it felt just like any other interview, a balance of charm and political edge. Stephen welcomed her with a pleasant tone, blending humor into his words as always. He asked questions about her role, about her experience handling the press, and even tossed in a few jokes about Washington. Karoline played along, laughing lightly, responding with grace and confidence. It looked like the interview would proceed smoothly, the kind of polished conversation that late-night viewers were used to. But behind the smiles and laughter, a subtle current of tension began to rise. Stephen, a master of tone, shifted slightly. His questions took on a sharper shape, not aggressive, not yet, but more pointed. He referenced a recent White House briefing where Karoline had defended a policy decision that had sparked criticism. His voice remained casual, but his eyes hinted at challenge. Karoline responded with practiced ease, offering a clear defense, but her words were more cautious now, carefully measured. The audience didn't seem to notice the shift right away. They still laughed when prompted, still clapped when expected, but something had changed in the air. The casual conversation had started to evolve into something more layered. There was a pause that hung just a second too long after one of Stephen's comments, and Karoline's smile faltered just slightly before returning to its usual form. These were small signals, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but they marked the beginning of a conversation that would spiral far from its intended path. Stephen moved to another topic, referencing a controversial decision made by the administration in recent weeks. His tone remained even, but his question pressed deeper. Karoline straightened in her chair. Her response was still firm, still composed, but it carried a hint of defense now, a trace of resistance in her tone. She spoke carefully, choosing words that framed the administration in a favorable light, but the weight of the question had shifted the dynamic between them. There was no shouting, no outburst, not yet. But in the subtle exchanges between host and guest, something more intense was brewing. Stephen leaned slightly forward, listening closely. Karoline's gaze stayed steady, but her posture had changed. The ease she had walked in with was slowly being replaced by a more rigid presence, as though she knew that the questions ahead would not be easy, and that the smiles around her were starting to fade. The crowd began to sense the undercurrent of discomfort. Laughter became more cautious, applause more hesitant. No one could quite put their finger on it, but the tone of the room had shifted. The lights were still bright, the stage still polished, but the show no longer felt like entertainment. It was starting to feel like something heavier. Stephen mentioned a policy involving press restrictions, something Karoline had addressed in a previous statement. The moment he brought it up, Karoline's expression changed for just a second. Perhaps annoyance, perhaps irritation. She recovered quickly, delivering a confident response, but that second had said enough. She was aware that the questions were becoming less about her role and more about her choices, her words, and the meaning behind them. Still, she pressed forward. Her voice remained strong, her points clear. She spoke of transparency, of leadership, of standing by the decisions made by the White House. But Stephen was not finished. His next question touched on public perception, on the criticism the administration had faced from both media and citizens. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't far from one. Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly. She gave a diplomatic answer, one that suggested resilience and loyalty, but there was a flicker of something behind her voice now. Tension, disagreement, frustration. The audience, sensing the shift, quieted a little more. The clapping had nearly stopped. People leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't what they had expected, and it certainly wasn't what the producers had planned. The segment was supposed to be light, perhaps a bit political, but not intense. Yet here they were, two figures seated across from one another, engaged in a battle of words, masked in politeness, but loaded with challenge. Each question now felt like a step toward a cliff, and each answer felt like a tightrope walk over that edge. As the show went to commercial break, the tension in the room remained unspoken but undeniable. No one said it out loud, but something had changed. The smiles were no longer comforting. The conversation was no longer friendly. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the wind had started to blow, and everyone could feel it coming. It didn't take long after the commercial break for the temperature in the room to change. The lights were still soft and familiar, the audience still clapping on cue, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Stephen Colbert returned to his seat with that same signature smirk, but now there was a sharper edge behind his smile. Karoline Leavitt sat just as composed as before, but her shoulders were straighter, her gaze more focused. Gone was the relaxed charm of a routine late-night appearance. In its place stood two individuals, each aware that the air between them was beginning to crack. Stephen wasted no time easing back into the conversation. He picked up where they left off, but the tone was different now. His questions weren't just playful pokes. They were pointed, carefully worded challenges aimed squarely at Karoline's defense of the administration. He referenced a recent policy that had ignited public backlash, asking if the White House had any regrets about how it was handled. It was a fair question on the surface, but there was weight behind it. Karoline's jaw tightened just slightly. Her answer came quickly, clipped, and precise. She defended the decision, explained the reasoning, and spoke about long-term strategy. Her voice was steady, her words professional, but they lacked the warmth of her earlier replies. The audience picked up on the shift. A few nodded quietly, others sat more still, waiting to see where this would go. It was subtle, but undeniable. The interview was no longer about understanding her role. It was about testing her stance. Stephen listened with that patient, amused expression he wore so well. But his next question followed swiftly, and it stung. He brought up the administration's record on transparency, pointing out inconsistencies between what had been promised and what had played out. It was no longer just about public reaction. It was about accountability. Karoline's tone cooled further. She didn't hesitate to respond, but this time her words carried a sharper tone. She countered with data, past examples, and emphasized the complexity of governance. It was clear she felt cornered, even if she didn't show it outright. She didn't stumble, but the defensive layer in her voice was thickening. Word by word. She was no longer smiling. Her answers came faster with less cushion. The polished surface of political professionalism was beginning to show stress. The audience, once lively and engaged, had grown noticeably quieter. They were watching closely now, sensing that this was more than the usual late-night banter. Even the laughter had started to fade when Stephen made a sarcastic remark about alternative facts. The joke landed with an awkward thud. A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Karoline didn't even blink. Her lips stayed sealed, her posture firm. Stephen tried another joke. This one about how he never expected to grill a press secretary under stage lights brighter than those in the White House briefing room. Again, Karoline didn't laugh. Her eyes held his steady and unreadable. The temperature on stage dropped a degree with every passing minute. Behind the scenes, the crew remained silent, their eyes locked on the monitors. This wasn't what anyone had anticipated. A fun segment had evolved into a careful verbal sparring match. Neither Stephen nor Karoline had raised their voices, but the tension between them filled the space like static before a storm. Each question, each response layered on top of the last, building something heavier. Karoline, for all her control, was showing signs of pressure. Her hands tightened slightly on the armrests. Her responses, while still clear and composed, were becoming more clipped. The energy she brought into the room at the start had begun to shift. She was defending, correcting, clarifying. Every sentence was a shield. She wasn't answering for the sake of connection anymore. She was fighting to maintain control. Stephen's strategy was equally careful. He never crossed the line into direct confrontation, but he pushed just hard enough to keep her off balance. He didn't raise his voice, but his choice of words became more surgical. When he referenced a recent scandal involving a senior administration official, the room stiffened. It was the kind of moment that could shift everything, and it almost did. Karoline's response was immediate. She brushed off the mention, redirecting the topic toward broader goals, avoiding the pitfall of a name. But her voice had sharpened again, and this time the defensiveness was plain. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It was personal, about her credibility, her loyalty, her place at the podium. In a time of increasing national skepticism, the audience could feel the discomfort building. Laughter had vanished. There was no applause now, only silence broken by the careful, deliberate exchange of words. The tension wasn't explosive yet, but it was undeniably close. People shifted in their seats, exchanged glances, uncertain whether they were witnessing an interview or something far more serious. And still both of them tried to hold the line. Stephen, beneath his jabs and sarcasm, kept his tone light. Karoline, behind her defenses, maintained her posture. But the cracks were growing. It was clear neither of them was willing to back down. What had begun as a routine appearance was becoming something else entirely. A power struggle playing out in real time on national television under the gaze of millions. By the end of the segment, the atmosphere was dense. There had been no shouting, no walking off, no dramatic declarations, but everyone watching inside the studio and across the country knew something was building, something big, something unspoken, waiting just beneath the surface. And they knew the next segment might be the one where it all unraveled. Under the bright stage lights, the third segment began, but something was different. The rhythm of conversation that had carried them through the earlier parts was now fractured, jagged. Stephen Colbert, still seated comfortably in his chair, wore a familiar grin, one that usually disarmed his guests. But this time that smile had a different weight behind it, something colder, sharper. The previous back and forths had been tense, sure, but they still danced around the edge of civility. Now it felt like Stephen was about to step over that line. Without warning, Stephen brought up a controversial policy that had ignited fierce backlash across the country. A decision the administration had defended publicly, one that Karoline herself had been the face of during a particularly heated press briefing months ago. As he introduced the topic, he quoted her directly, replaying her past words back to her with careful precision. The mention of the policy alone was enough to shift the mood, but the audience's silence became deafening when Stephen looked directly at her and asked, "Do you still stand by what you said?" Karoline didn't answer immediately. For the first time since stepping onto that stage, she didn't reach for her words like a trained professional. She froze. Not dramatically, not with gasps or visible panic, but just enough that everyone noticed. Her eyes didn't dart. They locked forward. Her jaw stiffened. Her hands, once resting easily on the arms of her chair, clenched slightly. In that fraction of a second, the pressure of the moment revealed itself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but sharp. She began to explain the complexities of the decision, emphasizing nuance, long-term goals, and misunderstood intentions. But her words lacked their usual edge. It wasn't weakness. It was something else. Something like walking a tightrope under the gaze of a nation that was no longer giving her the benefit of the doubt. Stephen didn't interrupt at first. He let her talk, but when she finished, he leaned forward, his tone slightly more pointed. "That's a very careful answer," he said. "But you didn't actually say whether you still believe it was the right thing to do." The room went still again. This time, the silence felt like it stretched forever. The audience, so used to clapping after sound bites or laughing at clever punchlines, was now caught in a kind of suspense. Applauding felt inappropriate. Laughing would feel cruel, and so they did nothing, just watched. Karoline's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. She blinked just once, and then the words arrived, but they were slower now, more measured. She repeated that she stood by the administration's decision, but it came with more qualifiers, more caution. She was trying to defend her position without igniting the room. But Stephen wasn't giving her space to control the narrative. He leaned in closer, asking, "So, if you could go back and say it differently, would you?" It was a trap, and Karoline knew it. Her back straightened further and her tone grew more assertive. She insisted that her words had been taken out of context and that the media had twisted the message, but the tension was now impossible to mask. Her voice, while steady, had an edge, not the polished sharpness of political rhetoric, something more personal. There was frustration under the surface. She was holding it together, but only just. Stephen, sensing the shift, pressed harder. He referenced specific statistics, brought up emotional testimonies, reminded her of how the policy had impacted real people, real stories that had made headlines. Each example was another chisel striking at her composure. And then it happened. Stephen quoted a line. One she had said during a press briefing that had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. It had been mocked, debated, and used by critics as a symbol of how disconnected the administration had become. As soon as the words left his mouth, the energy in the room changed completely. Karoline's eyes widened, her mouth opened, then closed, and then her expression shifted. Not to panic, not to fear, but to anger. It was subtle at first, a tightening of the eyes, a flare of the nostrils, but it was there. For the first time in the entire interview, the anger she had been suppressing peeked through. She leaned forward slightly, her voice firmer than before. She accused Stephen of misrepresenting her, of cherry-picking a single line and weaponizing it. Her tone wasn't defensive anymore. It was confrontational. She wasn't just explaining policy. She was defending her character, her integrity, the role she had built her career around. The audience didn't know what to do. Some gasped quietly. Others sat frozen. The usual rhythm of applause and laughter was gone. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was raw, real, personal. Stephen responded coolly. But even he seemed caught off guard by the shift. He tried to play it off with a quip, but it fell flat. The joke didn't land. No one laughed. Not even the band attempted a clever drum beat. Karoline took a breath. Deep and deliberate, but it didn't settle her. The fire in her expression remained. She looked at Stephen with a gaze that said, "You've pushed too far," and maybe he had. This wasn't just about disagreement anymore. The balance had tipped. One comment had struck too deep, and now they weren't exchanging views. They were holding their ground in a battlefield made of words. By the end of the segment, the energy in the studio was unrecognizable. The audience didn't cheer. No one stood. It was as if they were all trying to process what they had just witnessed. No one could quite name what was happening. But everyone knew it wasn't over. Not even close. The tension that had been building for the past segments finally erupted like a pressure valve snapping under force. Karoline Leavitt, still seated under the glare of the studio lights, shifted forward in her chair. Her words no longer came with a polished tone of a practice press secretary. They were sharper now, louder, and unmistakably fueled by frustration. She raised her voice, no longer masking her irritation behind formal language. Her voice, once cool and composed, now carried the weight of someone who felt cornered and misrepresented. Stephen Colbert, for his part, remained seated and calm, but his calmness didn't come across as kindness. It felt like controlled provocation, a deliberate refusal to back down. He didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. He simply responded, his tone steady and his words precise. But the contrast only made things worse. Karoline's escalating emotion against Stephen's composure created a clash that was almost unbearable to watch. The audience, once merely observing, was now reacting. Gasps rippled through the crowd with each exchange. A few shouted remarks echoed from the back of the studio. Unclear words, but full of reaction. Some were shocked by Karoline's tone, others by Stephen's insistence. The atmosphere had transformed completely. What started as a typical late-night segment now felt like a live political showdown. Karoline leaned in, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as she made a point. Her voice cracked slightly from the intensity, but she pushed through, demanding to be heard. She accused Stephen of deliberately framing her and twisting her words for the sake of entertainment. Her tone wasn't just defensive. It was personal. Every sentence she delivered was packed with a raw sense of betrayal. Like she believed this was never meant to be an interview, but a trap. Stephen responded without raising his voice. He repeated that the questions were fair, that the public deserved answers, that her role in the administration came with accountability. But his calm rebuttals only seemed to fan the flames. Karoline interrupted, not once, but several times. She cut through Stephen's words with increasingly firm objections, at one point nearly shouting over him. Her voice rang across the studio, echoing slightly from the tension in the room. The band, usually ready to jump in with light-hearted cues, stayed silent. The camera crew didn't shift. Everyone was locked in place. Finally, as Stephen tried once again to reframe his question and keep the segment alive, Karoline snapped. She stood up suddenly, the abruptness catching even Stephen off guard. Her chair slid slightly behind her as she rose, and the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. The sound of her heels against the studio floor as she took a step forward echoed in the silence. She pointed slightly, not aggressively, but with certainty, as if to underline her words. "I'm done," she said, her voice no longer cracking, but ringing with finality. "You didn't bring me here for a conversation. You brought me here to ambush me." Stephen blinked but didn't respond immediately. It was rare for someone to walk off his show and rarer still for them to do it live in front of an audience that had no idea whether this was still part of the show or something entirely different. Karoline took one last look around. Not at Stephen, not at the audience, but at the entire set. The lights, the cameras, the scripted comfort of television. All of it now felt like a stage built to trap her. She didn't wait for a reply. She didn't offer a closing statement or a dramatic final word. She simply turned and walked. The audience sat frozen. Some looked to Stephen for a cue, unsure of how to react. A few clapped, but the sound died quickly. Others whispered to each other in disbelief. No one had expected the segment to end like this. Stephen watched her go, still seated behind his desk. His face showed a mixture of surprise and calculation, like he knew something monumental had just happened, but wasn't sure yet whether he had gone too far. As Karoline disappeared behind the curtains and off the stage, the studio was left in stunned silence. A few crew members moved quietly, unsure if they should cut to commercial or wait for a signal. The cameras lingered awkwardly on Stephen, who finally cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. But nothing about the show felt normal anymore. This wasn't just a guest leaving. This was a confrontation that had gone off the rails, and now the entire country would be watching. The clip was already being pulled by editors backstage. Producers were rushing to figure out how to handle what just happened. The headlines were writing themselves. And in the middle of it all, Stephen Colbert sat quietly, processing the fallout that was about to begin. The moment Karoline Leavitt disappeared behind the curtain, the studio fell into a stunned stillness that didn't feel real. Stephen Colbert sat frozen at his desk, his notes untouched, his gaze lingering on the space where she had just stood. The band didn't play. The laughter track didn't roll. The cameras cut to commercial, but even that transition felt jarring, like everyone had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to. Backstage, the production team scrambled. The control room lit up with activity. Phones rang, producers barked directions, and social media managers were already pulling clips from the feed. They all knew this wasn't just another awkward guest segment. This was a cultural flashpoint in the making. Meanwhile, outside the studio walls, the internet ignited. Within minutes, #Karoline walks off and #Colbert showdown were trending across platforms. Twitter turned into a battlefield. Instagram flooded with still shots of Karoline mid-exit. TikTok creators began stitching the footage with shocked reactions, dramatic edits, and instant takes. YouTube channels clipped the moment and uploaded breaking thumbnails with titles screaming about the fiery exchange that had just aired. News networks broke from their regular programming. Major anchors paused to discuss the confrontation live on air. The video replayed again and again. Karoline raising her voice, Stephen pushing back, the dramatic stand, the walk-off. Every frame was dissected, every word analyzed. Some called it a meltdown, others called it bravery. In the hours that followed, opinion pieces began pouring in. Conservative pundits hailed Karoline as a fighter, someone who stood up against media bias and refused to be mocked on national television. They said she was ambushed, provoked, and rightfully walked off. They called it proof of how liberal media platforms disrespect anyone with opposing views. Progressive voices defended Stephen. They argued that tough questions were necessary, that Karoline couldn't handle accountability, and that walking off a show was a sign of weakness, not strength. They criticized her for not answering, for turning a debate into a spectacle. But there was a third group, too. People who weren't sure what to think. Viewers who had tuned in, expecting comedy, now found themselves watching a cultural storm. They replayed the interview trying to understand where things went wrong. Was it Stephen's tone? Karoline's defensiveness? Did either of them cross a line? By midnight, the entire country seemed to be weighing in. Hashtags trended worldwide. Memes circulated rapidly, some mocking Karoline, others targeting Stephen. One viral image showed Stephen's stunned face captioned with, "When a comedy show turns into a congressional hearing." Another had Karoline storming off with the words, "Press secretary or drama queen" plastered across it. Stephen's team issued a short statement. Tonight's episode of The Late Show took an unexpected turn. We respect our guests' right to speak and to walk away. It was vague, deliberate, and gave nothing away. Karoline, on the other hand, said nothing, and that silence became its own story. People began refreshing her social media profiles every few minutes, looking for any sign of a response. Her absence only added to the mystery. Was she embarrassed, planning a statement? Was this a strategy? Or was she genuinely shaken? News vans showed up outside the White House early the next morning. Reporters shouted questions at press staff hoping for a comment. Rumors spread that Karoline had cancelled her public appearances for the next few days. Inside political circles, the incident became the talk of the moment. Cable news panels gathered guests to debate the walk-off. Former press secretaries weighed in. Comedians made monologues out of the chaos. Late-night shows across the board opened with jokes about Stephen's surprise showdown. But even as the comedy rolled on, the seriousness underneath wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't just TV anymore. The debate soon turned toward what the moment represented. Was it a sign of deepening divisions in the country? Of media no longer being a neutral space? Of politics bleeding into every corner of entertainment? Or was it simply a clash of egos that got out of hand? Politicians began tweeting about it. Some praised Karoline for standing her ground. Others mocked her inability to stay calm under pressure. The president's office refused to comment, but even their silence felt deliberate. And still, Karoline said nothing. That silence became the most powerful part of the story. Speculation soared. Some thought she was regrouping, planning a powerful comeback statement. Others claimed she was being advised to stay quiet. Every hour without a response added to the pressure. Meanwhile, Stephen, now at the center of this unexpected controversy, was reflecting. Sources from inside the production team described a quiet mood after the show. Stephen reportedly didn't speak much once the cameras stopped. He sat at his desk for a long time after the audience left, replaying the moment in his head. Those closest to him knew he liked to push boundaries, but even he hadn't expected the moment to spiral like that. He had intended to ask hard questions, yes, but not to cause a walk-off, not to become the story himself. The next night's episode aired with an unusually serious tone. Stephen opened by acknowledging what had happened. He didn't apologize. He didn't defend himself. He simply said, "Last night, things got heated. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted, but it happened. And now we're all talking about it." And that was true. America was still talking. The walk-off was no longer just about Karoline or Stephen. It had become a reflection of the cultural climate, a symbol of how fragile conversations had become, how quickly civil discourse could unravel, how even a comedy show could become a stage for a national reckoning. The fallout had begun, and no one knew yet how far it would go. The incident on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert didn't just make headlines, it rewrote them. In the days that followed Karoline Leavitt's dramatic walk-off, the moment was replayed on every major network, analyzed in panel discussions and debated across dinner tables nationwide. It no longer felt like a late-night segment gone wrong. It felt like a cultural turning point, the kind that doesn't just fade after 24 hours. Karoline's decision to remain silent only added fuel to the fire. Every hour that passed without a tweet, a press release, or even a vague response was treated like a revelation. Political analysts speculated on her strategy. Was it a calculated move to let the media frenzy grow, or was she genuinely regrouping, figuring out how to respond to the storm she had unexpectedly walked into? The silence began to feel deafening. In Washington, elected officials couldn't avoid the topic. Senators, representatives, and governors were asked about it during press events and interviews. Some used the opportunity to criticize mainstream media, claiming the incident proved how conservative voices were mistreated on liberal platforms. Others defended Colbert, arguing that political figures should be prepared for difficult questions, especially in the public spotlight. Former press secretaries across different administrations weighed in as well. One called Karoline's walk-off a missed opportunity to stand her ground. Another applauded her for knowing when to walk away from a disrespectful environment. The range of perspectives only made the moment feel more significant, less like a TV outburst and more like a raw shock test of American values. Media scholars began writing ops about the blending of politics and entertainment. Was this what happens when policy meets punchlines? When late-night hosts become cultural interrogators? The incident didn't just pit two people against each other. It forced the country to examine the nature of public discourse in a deeply polarized era. And still Karoline said nothing. That choice alone transformed the story. Her silence was interpreted in 100 different ways. Some said it showed poise and dignity. Others said it reflected fear or a lack of answers. But everyone agreed. Her refusal to engage made the public lean in even more. Stephen Colbert, for his part, didn't shy away. On the next few episodes, he handled the situation with a mix of sincerity and satire. He made a few jokes about the walk-off, but also addressed the tension that had led to it. He told his audience, "When you invite someone on your show, you expect a conversation, not a cliffhanger ending." The crowd laughed, but the underlying seriousness was hard to miss. Soon, news coverage evolved from the walk-off itself to its broader impact. Editors began linking it to larger issues. Political intolerance, the collapse of bipartisan conversation, and the ever-blurring line between media and government. What started as an awkward interview had become a nationwide referendum on civility and the press. Colleges held panel discussions about it. High school classrooms debated who was right and who went too far. Editorial pages took sides. One columnist wrote, "It was never about the questions or the answers. It was about who gets to speak and who decides the rules." For a brief moment, Karoline's silent exit overshadowed every other headline. It touched nerves no one expected. Then days later, something unexpected happened. Karoline broke her silence, but not with a press conference, not with a TV interview, not with a Twitter thread. She published a short, calmly worded article in a national paper. In it, she wrote that while she respected the role of the press and understood the nature of late-night television, she had felt targeted, not questioned. She claimed the interview became less about ideas and more about ridicule. And she defended her choice to walk away by quoting a simple line. "Sometimes staying silent says more than speaking ever could." The piece went viral. Her supporters called it graceful. Her critics called it evasive. But it gave the public what they'd been waiting for. A glimpse into her state of mind, her reasoning, her side of the story. In the days that followed, the tone of the debate shifted. People began reflecting not just on what happened, but why it mattered. Why a brief, unscripted moment on television could become a flashpoint for so many deeper issues. Some said it marked the end of respectful interviews between politicians and entertainers. Others believed it was a necessary confrontation, a line drawn in the sand. A few even suggested it would influence how future press secretaries engage with the media, especially in hostile environments. Political candidates began referencing the moment in their speeches. Campaign ads included lines about walking away with dignity or standing firm under pressure. What had happened on The Late Show no longer belonged to the people in that studio. It had become a symbol, a mirror for a divided nation. And like all symbols, it meant different things to different people. For some, Karoline's walk-off was a moment of empowerment, a refusal to be publicly humiliated. For others, it was a failure to face accountability. For many, it was a reminder that even the most controlled environments can erupt when tension meets truth. Long after the media cycle moved on, people still remembered, still talked about it, still debated it in classrooms, in office lunchrooms, in family group chats. And in the end, that was the legacy of that night. Not the confrontation itself, but the questions it forced America to ask. What kind of conversations do we value? What kind of voices do we silence? And when the cameras stop rolling, who really gets the last word?